Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to work on week 4, the lecture for week 4. So basically what we are going to discuss today is about what is considered a non-argument. Okay, so we did arguments before, so today we are going to move to the next one, which is what is not considered an argument. But before we go into that, let's go into the preview of what we are going to look into today. So basically we are going to distinguish arguments from non-arguments, and we are going to look into the 5 types of non-argumentative discourse. So let's look into the idea of arguments versus non-arguments. Well, basically, arguments would be, as we discussed before, the inclusion of 2 things, conclusion plus premise. So if you have the conclusion plus premise in one piece of, say for example, sentence, then it is considered an argument. So it doesn't matter if it is in a written form or if you're talking to another person, as long as you have the conclusion or premise, and premise, combine it together, it becomes an argument. And also remember that arguments can be formulated with more premises as well, but you need to have a conclusion to that. All right. So basically, we can distinguish arguments from non-arguments using a basic test. And the basic test consists of these 5 types of non-argumentative discourse. So it would be reports, unsupported assertions, conditional statements, illustrations, and explanations. So I'm gonna explain every and each one of these in detail. All right. So let's go into report first. Basically, reports are to convey information about subjects. So when we talk about report, it's not really from the person who's talking, who's actually coming up with a report, but it is from another person, and this person who's reporting the piece of information is merely reporting the piece of information without any reasoning to why he or she is saying so. So basically what he or she is doing is narrating and informing. That's the idea. They are just narrating and informing. And whatever information is coming from the other person or from the other party, it is the other person's argument, not the person who is reporting. All right, so we need to understand that when it comes to reports, it's not from the person who's writing it or from the person who's saying it, but rather from the person of whom the other person is getting the information from. All right. So if you look at the slide, you have an example over here. Sweeping changes occurred in demographics, economics, culture, and society during the last quarter of the 20th century. The nation aged and more of its people gravitate to the Sunbelt, spoiling urban corridors, and age critics challenge old central cities as sites for commercial as well as residential development. Rapid technological change fueled the growth of globalized industries, restructuring and labor force to feed a post-industrial economy. So basically, this is a report. It's not really from the person who's writing this, but this person got it from another person and wrote this piece of information. So we can't say that this is an argument because it is on the surface, a report of something, just convey information about something. All right. Now, moving on to the next one, unsupported assertions. So what is an unsupported assertions? Well, basically, these are statements about what a speaker or writer happens to believe. So when you say that it is something from a point of view of a speaker or writer, it can be true or false, rational or irrational, but these are considered parts of an argument only if the writer or the speaker claims that they follow or support another piece of claim. So if it is just something which they happen to believe, then it is not considered an argument. It is considered unsupported assertions. All right. So this is an example of an unsupported assertion. I believe that it is not dying that people are afraid of, something else, something more unsettling and more tragic than dying frightens us. We are afraid of never having lived or coming to the end of our days with a sense that we were never really alive, that we never figured out what life was for. So this example is not an argument because there is no claim that any of these statements follow from or imply any other statements. So basically, this is what we call an example of an unsupported assertion. Now, the next one, number 3, would be conditional statement. So what is a conditional statement? Conditional statement, the easiest way to explain this is the usage of if. All right, so when you have if in a sentence, it becomes conditional, and it is considered a conditional statement. All right, so basically they're made of two basic parts. The first one is what we call antecedents, where we use the word if in that phrase, and the second part is what we call the consequence, where usually we use the word then. All right, so examples would be if it rains, then the picnic will be cancelled. You must speak French if you grew up in Quebec. If at first you don't succeed, don't try skydiving. So in all these sentences, you have the word if, and therefore it is considered a conditional statement. And conditional statements are not considered arguments because it is just something, it is just a condition. If something happens, then something else is going to happen, right? Now, conditional statements also need not to be explicitly in if-then form. So basically, even if you don't use the if, sometimes you can interpret it as a conditional statement. For example, should it rain, the picnic will be cancelled. It has the same meaning if you use if it rains, the picnic will be cancelled. So it has the same meaning, but we are not using the word if here. But either way, this is still considered conditional statements, whereby we won't call this we won't call this an argument. All right. So as mentioned before, conditional statements are not arguments because there is no claim that any statements follows from any part of a conditional statement. All right. However, in saying that, although conditional statements are not arguments, sometimes it do involve a process of reasoning, whereby when you look at whole statement, or when you look at the phrase or the sentence, sometimes you do have a reasoning behind it. So, for example, if Rhode Island were larger than Ohio, and Ohio were larger than Texas, then Rhode Island would be larger than Texas. So, if you look at this example be given, it is logical. It involves a process of reasoning, but it does not mean that this is an argument. Still, this is considered conditional statements, right? Although conditional statements are not arguments, they can be a part of the argument. How? Very simple. If you use an argument and if you include the conditional statement in that argument and it makes perfect sense, where it creates a chain of arguments, then we call it an argument. Say, for example, if Alice fails critical thinking, she'll be placed on academic probation. Alice will fail critical thinking, so Alice will be placed on academic probation. If you look at the last two sentences, these are perfectly examples of arguments. So even if you include the first part of this argument, whereby it is considered a conditional statement, it is still considered a part of the argument, basically because Alice will fail critical thinking. So if you disclude the second and third sentence, then the first sentence is not considered an argument. But if you include the first sentence into sentence 2 and 3, it is considered an argument. And it is what we call a chain argument, as I mentioned before, because the antecedent of the first statement is linked to the consequence of the last statement by a chain of intervening conditional statements. All right? Now, moving on to number 4. So basically, illustrations are intended to provide examples of a claim rather than prove or support the claim. So what does it mean? Basically, when we say illustrations, it means examples. So examples can never be a part of the argument because examples are not used to argue. Examples are used to showcase or make things clearer than to what the speaker is trying to say. All right. So if you look at the example here, many wildflowers are edible. For example, daisies and daylilies are delicious in salad. So when you look at the example here, the example is just stating that daisies and daylilies are examples of wildflowers which can be eaten. All right, but it does not state in any way that it proves the idea that many wildflowers are edible. Okay, so do you get what it means? Hopefully you do. So if you look at the example here, it's just mentioning two types of flowers. daisies and daylilies, but it's not really proving the fact that many wildflowers are edible. All right, it's just saying, it's just giving us two different examples. That's it. All right. So the purpose of illustrations is not to provide convincing evidence for a conclusion, but merely to provide a few notable representative examples of a claim. Right? So let's look at the next example. Sometimes distinguishing arguments from illustrations can be a little bit tricky from two reasons. The first one is that phrases for like for example or for instance sometimes occur in arguments rather than illustrations. So sometimes when people argue, they use the idea of for example or for instance, but it does not really mean that they are trying to illustrate what they mean, but rather it is a part of their argument. All right, it is a part of their argument. So if you look at the example, purists sometimes insist that we should say between when two and only two objects are present, among if there are more than two. This, however, is an oversimplification. For example, no one would object to between in the main stumbling block in the present delicate exchanges between Paris, Athens, London, and Ankara. So if you look at the idea of, for example, here, it's not really giving us an illustration, but rather it is a point. It is a premise to the conclusion that something is so. All right. So in this manner, although this sentence is using, for example, it is not considered an illustration. All right. Now, the second one is there is sometimes a fine line between illustrating a claim and providing sufficient evidence for the claim. So if you look at the example here, many of the world's greatest philosophers were bachelors. For instance, Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Kant were all unmarried. Now, if you look at this example over here, do you think this is considered an argument? Think about it. Remember, yeah, if this, for instance, part here is just an illustration of something, it's not proving the idea in the conclusion, then it is not considered an argument because it is just an illustration. Now, we look at the conclusion here. The conclusion is that many of the world's greatest philosophers were bachelors. So we are focusing on the word many, greatest philosophers, bachelors. And when you say many, there's an idea of a certain number. If you say 9/10, that is already many. But here, for instance, it's only talking about 4 different people who are all unmarried. And when you say 4, you can't really conclude that these 4 people indicate that many of the world's greatest philosophers are bachelors. So for instance, here would be an illustration rather than sufficient evidence of the claim being given. Right? So this is not considered an argument. Okay. Now, the last one is what we call explanations. Now, explanations can be a little bit confusing because it can be confusing in a sense that to us, explanations can be part of an argument, but it really not is, right? So an explanation tries to show why something is the case, not to prove that it is the case. So for example, Titanic sank because it struck an iceberg. So when you look at the idea of it sank because it struck an iceberg, this is what we call an explanation. This is not what we call an argument, okay? Because it is basically just explaining why something happened. So if you look at the idea of Titanic sank, and you look at the idea of it struck an iceberg, the idea of striking an iceberg is just explaining why Titanic sank. All right? So explanations have 2 parts to it. The first part is what we call an explanandum. The second part is what we call an explanand. So explanandums is whereby the statement is explained, and the explanans is where the statement does the explaining. So you have 2 parts of what we call the explanation in a sentence. All right. Now, moving on. So basically, you have the example here. I fell down, which is considered the explanandum, and because I tripped, which is considered the explanand. exponents. So this was what I mentioned before. Now, to distinguish the arguments from explanations, there are 4 basic tests. So if you have all these tests, the common knowledge test, the past event test, the author's intent test, and the principle of charity test. So if it falls under any one of these categories, then it is not considered an argument, it is considered an explanation. All right, so let's have a look at the common knowledge test first. So is the statement that the passage seeks to prove or explain a matter of common knowledge? So if it is common knowledge, then probably it is considered an explanation rather than argument. So if you look at the example here, basically this example is taken from the context of America, so maybe it might not be familiar to you. Well, the North won the American Civil War because it had a larger population and a greater industrial base. So basically, this is what we call a common knowledge for the Americans. So everyone knows about this. Therefore, when it is a common knowledge, it is not considered an argument, but it is considered an explanation of what happened here. All right. Now, the second one is the past event test. So for the past event test, is a passage seeking to prove or explain an event that occurred in the past. So if it is talking about something which happened in the past and it is trying to explain something which happened in the past, well, the possibility of it becoming a explanation is higher compared to an argument. All right. So for example here, Mel flunked out because he never went to class. So when you say Mel flunked out because he never went to class, the idea of because he never went to class is something which happened in the past. And when it happened in the past, it is explaining something. It's not really arguing something, but it is explaining that he flunked out because he did not go to class. So when it is explaining something which happened in the past, it is not considered an argument, but rather it is considered an explanation. Okay. Now, the next one is the author's intent test. So, is the speaker or the author's intent to prove or establish that something is a case, that is to offer an account of why event has occurred or why something is the way it is? So, you need to ask yourself what the author is really trying to say. All right. If the author is trying to prove or establish that something is the case, then probably it's going to be an argument. But sometimes when you look at the idea of why the author is trying to say something, the author might be explaining something. So if you look at this, if you look at the example here, Kevin is majoring in political science because he wants to go to law school. Now this is an example of not an argument, but this is what we consider as an explanation. All right, an explanation. Now, let's go to the last one, the principle of charity test. So basically, the principle of charity test here is when we interpret unclear passages and we look at the idea that if the passage is a bad argument, then we don't consider it an argument at all. Okay, so if you look at what is being written here, when we never interpret a passage as a bad argument, the evidence reasonably permits us to interpret it as not an argument at all. As I mentioned before, when we look at a piece of argument and when it is a bad argument, we don't look at it as an argument. Okay, we don't look at it as an argument. Now, this test often proves helpful when the other tests yield no clear answer. So if it doesn't pass the 3 tests such as like what we mentioned before, the common knowledge test, the past event test, the author's intent test, then we use this principle of charity test. All right. So for example, Jeremy won't come to the frat party tonight because he has an important exam tomorrow. So if you look at this example being given, well, this is not considered an argument. This is, well, if you look at the three tests before, you can't really say that it suits all the three tests. Therefore, because of that, we are looking into the idea that this would fit into the principle of charity test. And when you look at the example being given here, we can't say that this is a good piece of argument, and therefore we are not going to accept this as an argument at all. Okay. And I think that is the end of the lecture for today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.